Unlike most stories of video game studios, Visceral's doesn't begin as an independent company scooped up by a monolith and forced to develop increasingly soulless titles. In a lot of ways, their story is the opposite. From their origins as just another EA studio named after the region they were based in, Visceral cut their teeth on everything from golf to James Bond, from The Simpsons to Formula One. They redefined genres, arguably started wholly new ones, and most definitely proved that even the most reserved of movies could have damn fun games based on them. But to examine Visceral is to also examine EA itself, to deep dive into the damage they've done to their strongest voices, and to reevaluate their place in a market that was becoming increasingly formulaic. Visceral's legacy is still affecting the market to this day, with remakes and successors of its biggest titles, and it's time we recognize it for the impact it had. This is the story of EA Redwood Shores, how it rose to prominence as Visceral Games, how it all crumbled, and the incredible legacy their games left behind.
Name's Bond. James Bond. Eject a seat, you're joking.
I never joke about my work, 007.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
Start your engine!
No wonder society is so corrupt.
Roll it again.
In 1995, Electronic Arts was one of the only publishers continuously turning a profit. In a time where companies like Viacom and Time Warner's journeys into video games had gone belly up, EA had more than doubled in size in the 90s, acquiring studios such as Manley & Associates, Origin Systems, and Bullfrog Productions in the last 5 years alone. They had more than outgrown their office in San Mateo, and were moving just a few miles down the 101 to Redwood Shores, California. Having primarily been a publisher who worked with outside studios or acquired already established ones and rebranded them, such as Distinctive Software, which became EA Canada in 1983, Electronic Arts would instead silo its development team in California into two studios, one named after their label EA Sports, and one named after their new city. Being essentially downstairs from the EA headquarters, and very rarely featuring the name EA Redwood Shores on the back of the box, it is worth pointing out that ironing out the exact details of their creation in early years is a little tricky. For all intents and purposes, EA Redwood Shores was indistinguishable from the regionless Electronic Arts that had worked on combat flight sims such as US Navy Fighters 97. This time, however, it seemed to be more focused on supplementing the work on the rapidly growing EA Sports brand, alongside the aforementioned sports studio and EA Canada. As a result, a look at personnel and development around this time is foggy at best, as the publisher has always been one to play their cards very close to their chest. EA Redwood Shores would officially release their first game in 1998, Future Cop LAPD. It featured a precinct mode that had gameplay similar to modern MOBAs, and predated mods in Warcraft and StarCraft that marked the start of that genre by about 4 years. While there is some debate in the community on whether or not 1989's Herzog Zwei was technically the first MOBA, starting a new studio in a new city by helping create a wholly new genre isn't a bad way to begin. Over the next couple of years, Redwood Shores would create games either underneath the EA Sports brand or within the world of arcade racing games on the first PlayStation. It wouldn't be until 2001 that they would break away from this, with their first Bond game, Agent Under Fire. Agent Under Fire is an outlier, and that's obvious almost immediately. While it came out well into the Pierce Brosnan era, it's the only game from that time to not feature him as Bond, instead opting for a sort of face-mash version of the 5 canonical actors to portray the character. But it's difficult to really pin down why. Part of that may be that Agent Under Fire also started life as a next-gen adaptation of The World Is Not Enough, the third Brosnan film from 1999, which received a tie-in game on the previous generation a year later. With trouble managing id Tech 3 and after calling on help from EA Canada to create the driving levels, Redwood Shores would make the switch to an original story in early 2001, giving Agent Under Fire a development cycle of just over a year in this form. That puts the game in a unique place. Besides the relatively story-light 007 racing, Agent Under Fire is the first of a long line of original Bond narratives in game form, allowing the team to surprise players and create something that was guaranteed to work in interactive media. It also shows what kind of Bond fans the team at EA Redwood was, with a plot that's just as, if not more wacky than your average Roger Moore film, featuring a villain who's replacing world leaders with evil clones. It's pulpy in a way that people think Bond is, but really hasn't been in a very long time. And being an original interpretation of the character sort of helps that, making it feel like a charming alternate history where Bond didn't get so self-conscious after the release of Austin Powers. And while there are better Bond games, very few capture this much of what a Bond film is in video game form. And most of those were developed by EA Redwood Shores, signaling a precursor to the non-GoldenEye Bond games that people remember fondly. Agent Under Fire isn't a perfect game or a perfect Bond game, with its abundance of loading screens, samey gadgetry, and kind of sluggish feeling shooting. But it's still a commendable effort, and an often forgotten entry that's actually worth returning to. It's charming, and also the beginning of Redwood moving away from a long line of sports games and into the worlds of some of film's most prestigious licenses, most prominently the next year with their move into Middle-earth. The license around the Lord of the Rings in video games has always been a little complicated. While initially the rights to tie-ins to the films fell in the hands of Electronic Arts, the rights to adapting the original novels from J.R.R. Tolkien was firmly in the hands of Vivendi. While there are games for all three in the trilogy released around the time of the films, that's largely by coincidence. Vivendi's Fellowship of the Ring was completely free from the influence of the films, featuring moments from the source material that were cut, such as The Hobbit's time with Tom Bombadil, and their sequel, named The Treason of Isengard after the original name for the Two Towers, was cancelled in 2003. At the same time, Electronic Arts' development cycle on their own Fellowship game didn't quite line up with the release schedule of the films, and developer Stormfront, with assistance from EA Redwood Shores, would instead move to The Two Towers, releasing their own adaptation that partially takes place between the two films only a month after Vivendi released their title. Stormfront, however, would step away from development on Return of the King, with it falling into the hands of EA Redwood Shores entirely. As a result, Return of the King is very similar to Two Towers, keeping what worked and examining what didn't. Characters' movesets feel more different, and because The Lord of the Rings is so spread out at this point, players can choose from multiple pathways through the story. It's a relatively simple game despite that, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Return of the King is the quintessential sleepover game, something you and your friends would play in co-op and tear through over a night or weekend. In a lot of ways, it reminds me a bit of the LEGO games, or even Marvel's Ultimate Alliance, where it thrives in its simplicity and its ability to be picked up and played, but also has enough depth in its upgrades to keep someone who isn't playing it with friends interested. It didn't rewrite the book, and that's okay. It's around this time that EA Redwood Shores would find its first serious mainstream success that wasn't a Tiger Woods game, and illustrate their potential as a studio. While Return of the King doesn't often come up in conversations around the best licensed games, at the time it was met very well. It comes as no coincidence that at the same time the studio was working on Return of the King, two former Crystal Dynamics employees, designer Brett Robbins and producer Glenn Schofield, would join the team. While unlike other EA studios such as Criterion or Maxis, whose bulk of their success points largely to one or two air quotes auteur figures, EA Redwood has never quite been that. However, Robbins and Schofield's work from the early days creating licensed games, until they were finally allowed to have their own identity, provides us with a bit of through line into what the studio that would become Visceral was. Most prominently in 2003, that was a studio that was starting to create some of the strongest entries in third-person action games. In the following year, they'd have the chance to prove it with their seminal return to the Bond franchise in 007 Everything or Nothing. To the team at EA Redwood Shores, 007 Everything or Nothing is a Bond film in everything but medium. From tapping Tomorrow Never Dies screenwriter Bruce Fairstein to being Pierce Brosnan's last performance as Bond, the entire game was designed from the ground up to be authentic. As a result, it's not a "it'll make you feel like blank" sort of experience. By shifting the perspective to third person and letting the character act as Brosnan would, rather than as the player would, there's a certain degree of separation that in less capable hands would feel damning. But here it just feels more authentic. Everything or Nothing was directly inspired by the production of a Bond film, doing away with their more original approach to the character and instead getting the real actors and real Hollywood VFX artists to build out the world. Every aspect of Bond is here, being one of the only games to capture the non-shooting side of combat incredibly well. That, coupled with exciting gameplay that allowed for real player expression and a solid pre-Gears of War cover system, EA Redwood Shores created the first 007 title where GoldenEye likely wouldn't even come up in the conversation. Unless you were saying, yeah dude, it's probably better than GoldenEye. Even following off the back of the last game, Eurocom's Nightfire, which was impressive in its own right, Everything or Nothing manages to show off the range of what games can do with the character. And with its more over-the-top attitude, even for a Brosnan film, that signature EA Redwood Shores DNA is still in there, moving away from clones and rocket-propelled BMWs to nanobots and motorcycles with flamethrowers. 1 year later, EA Redwood would complete their Bond trilogy with the release of From Russia with Love. Following the departure of Pierce Brosnan from the role of 007 in 2002, Electronic Arts now held the license to a franchise without a lead. In 2004, they would release GoldenEye Rogue Agent, developed by EA Los Angeles, an alternate history story based on the franchise's biggest villains. However, EA Redwood Shores would create a direct sequel to their work on Everything or Nothing in 2005, this time with the return of Sean Connery in From Russia with Love. From Russia with Love, the game, is not the grounded, paranoid spy film that the source material was. While executive producer Glenn Schofield would refer to it as a sort of director's cut, it's much more of an over-the-top rose-tinted glasses version of what this era was. The jetpacks from Thunderball, the DB5 from Goldfinger, and the volcano lair from You Only Live Twice are all here. It's obvious Redwood didn't want to squander the opportunity to play in this era. They wanted the iconography, and to simplify a relatively complicated plot into something that was fun to play in a linear fashion. And coming from a studio who had only ever done original stories in this universe, and obviously working on a tight deadline, I kind of can't blame them for trying to do a little more. From Russia with Love is barely an adaptation. While the broad strokes are there, characters like Krylenko are basically non-existent, and the finer details have been shaved off. But as a send-up to that era of Bond, it's hard to not kind of love it. It's definitely nostalgia, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I never really stopped grinning while revisiting this one. And a large part of that comes from the return of Connery as Bond. While his involvement may be slightly overstated, and it's safe to say that if he could record his lines from the comfort of his beach house in the Bahamas like he did for this one, he likely never would have stopped playing the character, there's a real charming quality to his incredibly old-sounding voice, reworking lines from 40 years prior.
Can I borrow a match?
Oh, I use a lighter.
It's better still.
Until they go wrong.
Pointing directly to his grandchildren being game fans, and the original film being his favorite of the Bonds he did, getting Connery, one of the highest profile actors of all time, to come out of retirement is no small feat. But even beyond that, From Russia with Love is still a solid offering. It refines the rougher edges from Everything or Nothing, the few that it had, and extends that player-directing Bond attitude. Levels are longer and transition more gracefully between vehicles and shooting. It's not perfect, but personally I'd be hard-pressed to call any other Bond game my favorite. And as a closer for EA's golden age with the license, it's not a bad way to end things. From Russia with Love all but proved what was suspected with Return of the King and Everything or Nothing, that they were more than capable of handling some of film's greatest licenses and doing them justice. But their next game was likely the biggest challenge yet, as just a little over a year before the release of their Sean Connery game, Redwood would be handed the keys to arguably the greatest film ever made, The Godfather. The Godfather, the video game, makes a lot of odd choices. Maybe that's because making The Godfather into a video game is an odd choice in the first place. Most of all is how it handles Michael Corleone. Unlike Redwood's previous games where the player would control someone like Bond himself or a member of the Fellowship, The Godfather doesn't let you play as any of the main cast, Michael most prominently. While some actors would return, such as Robert Duvall, James Caan, and even Marlon Brando for only a single line in his last acting role, Al Pacino's likeness is entirely missing. This is due to his likeness instead going to Radical Entertainment's Scarface: The World Is Yours, which was announced and released in the same year as EA Redwood's Godfather. What we get instead is a reinterpreted Michael in a similar way as Agent Under Fire. The player, on the other hand, is placed in the shoes of a recently hired goon, as he ascends the Corleone crime family alongside Michael, moving from an outsider to a trusted advisor, and frequently just off screen during the film's most iconic moments. You play a similar role as the baker in the hospital, and you're the one who gets to keep the cannoli. It's a testament to the Godfather the game's quality that this doesn't really feel cheesy or contrived. The world is convincing enough, and frankly the characters based on their original actors look good enough that it feels fairly earnest. And it being a more non-linear Grand Theft Auto inspired experience, it helps to keep you out of main missions for as long as possible. Like with Scarface, The Godfather features an extensive business management gameplay loop focused on intimidation and extortion. It's complicated, based on a risk versus reward that comes from being able to read NPCs and their weaknesses for better payouts. While I personally don't find it as rewarding or frantic as the one in Scarface, this feels like a much more ground floor aspect of the operation. And with its unique melee controls based on throwing punches by pushing the sticks and choking people by holding them down, it feels much more in line with the darker, more visceral feeling of violence in the film. In a lot of ways, this feels like an LA Noire in the 360's launch window rather than at the end of its cycle, with its clicky, almost Art Deco interface and an impressive for the time simulation of New York City. While it's been overshadowed by a lot of the 360's open worlds, its ideas for how to adapt The Godfather into a game that wasn't just bargain bin fodder was impressive. EA Redwood Shores would continue to grow in size, providing support for Maxis' console version of The Sims 2 Pets, creating the Wii-friendly My Sims franchise, and developing the last of their yearly Tiger Woods PGA Tour series of games that had helped to turn the athlete into the Tony Hawk or John Madden of the sport. The following year, however, Redwood would have the chance to take their games in a more colorful direction, and return to the styles of their work with Lord of the Rings, this time with a tie-in to the upcoming Simpsons movie with the Simpsons game. Following the success of Road Rage and Hit and Run from Activision and Radical Entertainment, the idea of a Simpsons game being truly great felt a little less absurd than it did only a few years prior. And with Electronic Arts doing what they did best and scooping up the licenses to franchises just as their games started to reach mainstream success, see also James Bond, in 2005 they would acquire exclusive game rights to The Simpsons. However, they would only release one title to consoles. Taking cues from the idea of the Simpsons movie and trying to burrow down into what a true quintessential Simpsons video game would look like, 2007's The Simpsons game is almost entirely parody. There are a lot of video game tropes being lampshaded here, and while its winking and nodding can feel a little trite in a post-Deadpool, post-Doki Doki Literature Club world, it's refreshing and almost fascinating to see what the writers of The Simpsons who worked on these games think video games are in 2007. But that also comes with an extra helping of thou doth protest too much, as while pointing out tropey designs and having self-awareness of how similar these ideas are to others, they're still here, and just as unoriginal as they are anywhere else. Comparatively, the opening to The Simpsons Hit and Run does something similar, with Bart pointing out how lame tutorials are and that we should hurry up so we can get through it. However, after that, it gets out of the way of itself and lets it stand on its own. The Simpsons game never really does that, and is bogged down in that more simplistic beat-em-up style we saw Redwood do with their Lord of the Rings tie-ins, but with overly long missions, a style of gameplay that was starting to get overly saturated with Lego, and an open world that's bigger than Hit and Run with basically no fun way to get around it. It's one of Redwood Shores' only missteps. Unfortunately, however, they would follow it up almost immediately with another, this time with a sequel to their Godfather game. On its surface, the differences between Part 2 and the original Godfather game seem subtle. However, as things move on, it's clear that EA Redwood has sort of lost the plot a little bit, focusing more heavily on the business management side and creating a more action-filled world. That might be due to Part 2's lack of cultural moments on par with the likes of Vito's Offer and The Horse and the Bet. It's a less well-known film, especially for me personally. However, it goes out of its way to downright ignore the source material altogether and sort of loses the charm of the whole exercise in the process. To sum The Godfather Part 2 up, it feels like a sequel to the first game rather than a tie-in to the second movie. It's taking what made the first game good and basically hand-waving everything else. But Redwood's Part 2 also just feels messier. The first game felt in line with something like LA Noire, creating a well-realized technical powerhouse intended to immerse players in not only a time period but an iconic film. On the other hand, Part 2 instead reminds me a bit of the earlier Saints Row's. It's kind of close to what you'd think of if someone said they made a Godfather video game while still being functional. Textures are muddy, combat is squirrely and confusing, and what was one of the PS2's most impressive looking games now feels like a lower budget early Xbox 360 title, despite coming out the same year as Arkham Asylum and Assassin's Creed 2. The Godfather Part 2 would be EA Redwood Shores' last licensed game, and their second to last under the name, calling into question if this was the result of some sort of contractual obligation before the studio's focus would be shifted to the development of new IP. Sandwiched in between Part 2 and the Simpsons game was EA Redwood's first attempt at creating its own world, one that instead started life as Electronic Arts' new System Shock game, and would change the entire ethos of the studio with its particularly visceral game design. When executive producer Glenn Schofield would approach EA with his science fiction horror game, EA didn't quite get it.
They were a bit freaked out. It was something they hadn't done since System Shock.
So in 2005, Schofield and creative director Brett Robbins would start work on their idea, this time converting what they had into the world of System Shock. While it was never intended as a true immersive sim successor to the series, it was enough to get Electronic Arts to greenlight the project. However, that same year, the horror genre would go from something niche to fully mainstream with the release of Resident Evil 4. Suddenly, their initial pitch of Resident Evil but in space was much more viable. When playing Dead Space, that Resident Evil influence is clear, even if they removed the tank controls and stationary aiming that were in earlier prototypes. But what's also obvious is how spongy of a team they were beyond that. Their love for science fiction is on full display here, taking influence in the plot from the likes of Event Horizon and Alien, and even going so far as to name the main character after Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. Even its aesthetics and the in-universe UI feel reminiscent of Metroid Prime, and tools like Kinesis feel reminiscent of Half-Life. But it's also distinctly EA Redwood Shores. Starting with James Bond and continuing through to The Godfather, Redwood Shores has put particular focus on location damage. It's ironically visceral, allowing players to choke out shopkeepers or shoot grenades and radios off of enemies' hips. Taking time to plan shots carefully is rewarding in a Redwood game. In Dead Space, that idea is taken to its conclusion, subverting zombie tropes with making the limbs the weak point. It's unique and something that is a challenge in Hour 1 and Hour 11, and being not much longer than that, it gives EA Redwood a chance to show off their ideas without overstaying their welcome. That dismemberment is a through line. It directly informs every combat encounter and how each new enemy and boss will be designed. On the other side is the ironclad Isaac, the Ishimura, and a constant feeling of being overwhelmed. Movement is slow and clunky, and every weapon is more of a repurposed mining tool than something actually designed for zombie killing. And the Ishimura, the derelict mining ship you're trapped on, was intended to be something between a Gothic cathedral and an oil rig, giving it deadly tight corridors to get cornered in, and large loading bays where being exposed is the only option. Dead Space is very good, doubly so as it was Redwood's first IP in nearly 10 years. People took notice, and being free of an attachment to some big brand and headed up by a passionate team of creatives who were obviously making the game they wanted, it was time for the studio to become something more than just another EA studio named after the region they were based in. In May of 2009, EA would reveal their new name for the studio, Visceral Games, with their official focus being on creating the next generation of action games. While they would still be located in the Electronic Arts campus in Redwood Shores, alongside the likes of Maxis, their entire structure was shifting in the wake of their newfound success.
For the past 2 years, we have adopted a new culture that prizes excellence above all else. Primal Action is the beating heart of the studio, and now our new name reflects that.
EA Redwood Shores was now allowed to have their own identity, and to create the games they wanted to make. Regardless of what the future would bring, at that point in 2009, the future was very bright for Visceral. General Manager Glenn Schofield, designer Brett Robbins, and longtime EA director Michael Condrey, however, would only remain at Visceral for a few months, as they would depart the studio in the fall to found Sledgehammer Games under Activision, where they would develop Call of Duty games until 2017. Despite their success, Visceral's work on the follow-up to Dead Space would be slow going. While still finishing up their sci-fi horror project and high on the shifting culture that allowed for more creative ideas, a group of developers would get together to create a game based on Jack the Ripper. The Ripper, as it was fittingly titled, was going to reuse the cel-shading text seen in the Simpsons game, and have players inhabiting the shoes of London's most famous serial killer, avenging his family who'd been murdered by vampires. With a messy shift from Visceral Redwood to the brand new Visceral Montreal, and pressure from studio execs to make everything in Frostbite, the game seemed doomed from the start. Similarly, while Visceral had largely been founded to develop new single-player mature-rated games, there was also pressure to make sure the Ripper had a multiplayer component. Following a half-finished demo of a semi-asymmetrical mode, EA would find themselves confused at where the team was going. To balance out Visceral's focus on single-player, they would instead shift the project into a fully multiplayer Xbox Live title named Blood-Dust, also once again moving it from Montreal to another satellite Visceral studio in Melbourne, before canceling the project altogether and closing Visceral Melbourne only a few years after they'd been created. Only a year after Dead Space in 2009, Visceral would release their first game under the new name, Dante's Inferno, taking influence from the epic poem and turning it into an over-the-top action game. If Dead Space was Visceral's Resident Evil, then Dante's Inferno was its Devil May Cry. Inspired by Dante's ability to flesh out a real physical feeling hell in poem form, Visceral's take is as over-the-top as it is unsettling. Walls are lined with still screaming bodies, and unbaptized babies are enemies alongside the Guardians of Hell. While it lacks that same commitment to tension as Dead Space, it shows just how versatile developers Visceral are, and just how much they love the bloody side of the horror genre. Dante's Inferno is God of War by way of Catholic guilt, Assassin's Creed by way of Doom. It's not reinventing the wheel, it's forging a damn good one in the fires of hell. It feels reminiscent of the fun, mindless, but in a good way hack and slash of Return of the King, taken to the next level and responding to the success of other character-based action games in the meantime. It's something that players were critical of around its release, but with the benefit of hindsight, has made it an excellent example of the genre. And with its interesting absolve/punish mechanic that feels like half the Little Sisters from BioShock and half like something from Dark Forces 2, it allows basically any enemy and a large number of historical and mythological dwellers of hell to be forgiven or punished for their sins. It shows Visceral as a team that's having quite a bit of fun with it, even if the game itself is largely humorless. Upon release, producer Jonathan Knight would be adamant that the team had no intentions of developing a sequel, despite the epic poem's 3 parts and the cliffhanger ending of the first game. The bulk of his team was instead being moved to help finish up Dead Space 2. However, this isn't entirely accurate. In 2011, Assassin's Creed 2 writer Josh Rubin would heavily hint that he had been hired by Visceral for, quote, a major unannounced sequel from Visceral Studios at EA Games. While it could have very well been the Simpsons game 2, Dante's Inferno was the more likely answer. When investigating the Ripper in 2018, Alex Riviello would also uncover information about the sequel, Dante's Purgatory. It was intended to be a more straightforward action game, and featuring a climbing mechanic focused on ascending the mountains of Purgatory to the gates of heaven. While it had a vertical slice and concept art, neither of which have been seen by the public, it was cancelled by EA due in part to the disappointing sales of the first game.
You know what they always tell budding game designers? If you want to make your opus, don't do it at EA.
Creating a follow-up to Dead Space was always going to be a challenge. It was a game that was nearly perfectly paced, with rigid rules that created tension and directly informed the world. More of that may feel like overstaying its welcome, and drastic changes may alienate old fans. From the get-go, Isaac is a voiced protagonist, and much more than just heavy breathing in a metal helmet. It's a double-edged sword, but as we move past the haunted house and space trope and into actually answering questions and fleshing out the world, having a player character that does more than just stare blankly at the much wider cast of characters feels almost necessary. And while even developers admitted it was a creative risk, beyond the first hour-ish of getting used to it, it's obvious it's done in commitment to feeling out a character in the midst of a psychotic break. Isaac is more than just someone for the player to inhabit. He's now one of gaming's unreliable narrators. What's interesting, however, is how strong Dead Space 2 is, despite being developed after the series' creators had departed Visceral. While I personally don't think it's better than the original, as the sort of singular space of the Ishimura is much more appealing to the types of horror I enjoy, I would never blame anyone for saying that this is the best Dead Space game. Everything people love about the series is here, and on a much bigger scale, in a way that's similar but not exactly the same as the shift from Alien to Aliens. The broad strokes of the gameplay are the same, but with a game like Dead Space, only a small amount of tightening up was necessary at all. And even then, that feels more like it was done to accommodate the volume of enemies being encountered. That being said, some of Dead Space's edges are starting to be filed off, and while game development is collaborative, it's obviously much less of a focused vision without Schofield and Robbins. Scares feel much more scripted, and its enemy variety could be better. However, it's obvious that the studio had something truly special on their hands, and that they were getting very good at making it. But as always with Visceral, those good times wouldn't last. To even an outsider, Dead Space 3 is overshadowed by the controversy around it. Where Dead Space 2 was conservative with its changes, Dead Space 3 commits fully to sacrificing much of what gave the series its identity. Combat is faster, simpler, and more in line with action games of the time, and as a result, tension is basically non-existent. And with a story that's less about interesting questions and more a series of MacGuffins strung together, with no actually satisfying resolutions, made even worse by the nearly insulting DLC, it's obvious that something got lost here. According to creative director Ben Wannett, Dead Space 3 was originally intended as a deep dive into Isaac's deteriorating mental state, building from what was shown in the second game. But Dead Space was also poised to be a big franchise for EA. While it never quite outdid expected sales numbers, with its slew of books, comics, and animated movies, the publisher thought it could be bigger than it was. What they felt it needed was mainstream appeal. Gone is the trademark weirdness, in is all the action EA thinks general audiences want. And alongside that is the half-baked co-op that the publisher had been asking for since Dead Space 1. Most controversially, however, were the time-saving microtransactions, which would give you a handful of resources for a couple bucks. There's really no other way to describe it other than gross. It's not necessary and definitely not required, and so it just feels like another way for EA to wring money out of the player. Naturally and unsurprisingly, Dead Space 3 would underperform, with critics citing these things directly. Following the release of Dead Space 3, Visceral's future began to feel uncertain. Their work was no longer developing new and exciting IPs, and now their flagship was a shell of its former self. Dead Space 4 was not put into development. Instead, the studio was shifted into a support role, first with the remaining satellite, Visceral Montreal, put on developing Army of Two: The Devil's Cartel. The main studio was pulled into work on Battlefield Hardline about a year before the release of the last Dead Space, creating a more grounded police-based version of military shooters. With their interest into EA's main shooter franchise, it's hard not to picture what happened to developers like Raven Software at Activision, where once great studios were forced into the Call of Duty mines until they were a shell of their former selves, or they were closed down. While it was by no means the worst in the Battlefield series, it would be the last title Visceral Games would ever release. The story of Visceral's closure is for the most part the story of Project Ragtag, an Uncharted-inspired Star Wars game being headed up by former Naughty Dog creative director Amy Hennig. In the wake of the Disney acquisition, the Star Wars license had fallen into the hands of Electronic Arts, and their studios were given the chance to have a go at the license. Project Ragtag was sort of out of the wheelhouse of a 2013 EA. Single-player games weren't as profitable for the publisher, and that attitude had partially came from the underperformance of Dead Space 3. But it was also a bit of return to form to the old EA Redwood Shores days. Visceral now had a strong vision, and a high-profile license to work with. Following the setup of EA Motive with the assistance of former Assassin's Creed producer Jade Raymond, Hennig and team would go into full development, setting out to create a space heist in the world of Star Wars. This, of course, would not go as planned. Near constant pressure would come from EA, forcing them to use Frostbite and being skeptical of a Star Wars story with no Jedi and Sith conflict. The scope was beginning to creep. Visceral had been reorganized, and Hennig was constantly butting heads with not only executives, but designers and developers alike. Following Motive being pulled from the project to assist with the second of EA's Battlefronts and layoffs at Visceral in 2016, Project Ragtag would struggle to meet milestone deadlines. Instead of fully pulling the plug on the project, however, EA would instead close Visceral altogether. In a statement, they announced that they were rebooting Project Ragtag, moving it to EA Vancouver and into something that, quote, players will want to come back to and enjoy for a long time to come, signaling that it had been shifted into something more in line with the games as a service model EA was now synonymous with, though what that was is unclear, as no other word has surfaced on the project at time of writing. Visceral's legacy is still felt in gaming to this day. In late 2022, Glenn Schofield's new developer Striking Distance Studios would release the Callisto Protocol, marketing it heavily based on its similarities to Dead Space and going as far as to include cut ideas from the first game. Only a few months later in 2023, EA would release a ground-up remake of Dead Space in a similar style to the recent Resident Evil remakes, and being headed up by the studio Visceral helped create, Motive Studios. Brett Robbins' own developer Ascendant would release Immortals of Avium in the same year as well. Both Striking Distance and Ascendant would face layoffs following the underperformance of their games. Despite their bad luck, the studio interference, and their incredibly short time developing original games, Visceral represents something. A time when studios under EA could not only have a strong identity, but earn it. How a push away from just another studio named after the region it's based in can lead to great games and build a team that's enthusiastic about what they're making. Or even how gratuitous violence and quality world building are enough to make a studio people remember long after they've closed.